For 500 years, the Roman Empire just dominated the Western world. I mean, it was a political and military powerhouse whose legacy you can still feel it today. But a dynasty this huge wasn't built in a day, and it certainly didn't fall in one either. All right, let's dive into this epic story. Its rise, its incredible golden age, and how it all eventually came apart.
So the biggest question, the one that kicks this whole thing off, is this. How does a republic, a state supposedly run by its citizens, turn into a system ruled by one all-powerful emperor? Well, the answer starts not with a king, but with a guy who was incredibly careful not to call himself one, Octavian, who we'd all soon come to know as Augustus.
After decades of just brutal civil war that basically tore the old republic to shreds, Augustus came out on top as the sole ruler. But he knew Romans absolutely hated the idea of kings. So instead of just declaring a monarchy, he pulled off a masterstroke of political theater. He created a system that looked and felt like the old republic, but was, in reality, a one-man show.
And the way he did it was just brilliant. He called himself Princeps, which just means first citizen. He didn't get rid of the Senate. Nope. He just controlled who was in it. He basically consolidated all the most important powers of a tribune, a censor, a proconsul into his own hands. And what did that mean? It meant he could veto any law, command the entire army, and oversee public morals. He kept up the illusion of the republic while holding all the real power. It was this genius design, the Principate, that created stability for his incredible 40-year reign and laid the groundwork for the entire empire.
But, Augustus's clever system had a huge, fatal flaw. While he built this incredible empire, he never really figured out a clear, legal, peaceful way to transfer power. This failure to solve the succession problem would become the empire's greatest weakness, a wound that was just going to keep reopening again and again.
And the dynasty he started, the Julio-Claudians, is a perfect, bloody example of this chaos. His successor, Tiberius, ruled through fear and paranoia. Then you get Caligula, whose reign spiraled into what a lot of historians basically call insanity. And finally, Nero, the egotistical artist emperor whose screw-ups led to a military coup and his own suicide. Yeah, hereditary rule turned out to be a recipe for disaster.
After Nero's death, there was no heir, and the empire just completely imploded. The year AD 69 became this brutal, violent free-for-all. I mean, think about it. In a single year, 4 different men, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, were all proclaimed emperor. And each one rose and fell by the sword in incredibly quick succession.
So the Civil War of AD 69 really pulled the curtain back on the new truth of the Roman Empire. The whole polite fiction of the Senate giving someone power, that was over. Ultimate authority didn't come from a vote in Rome anymore. It came from the loyalty of the legions out on the frontier. The new rule was simple. An army could make an emperor. And what the army could make, it could also break.
After all that chaos, a new dynasty started by Vespasian helped get things back in order. But it was the one that came after that, the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, that really found a solution. For a while, anyway. This period gave Rome almost a century of stability and prosperity, an era so successful it became known as the Age of the 5 Good Emperors.
Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. These guys presided over what many people consider the absolute peak of Roman civilization. They were skilled administrators, respected generals, and they somehow managed to dodge the paranoia and bloodshed of those earlier dynasties. So what was their secret?
It was simple and it was brilliant. Instead of power going to some often unqualified and unpredictable son, each emperor chose the best possible man for the job, a proven leader with talent and integrity, and then adopted him as his heir. This system of adoptive succession solved the empire's biggest problem. It created a government based on merit, not just the accident of who your father was.
And this right here perfectly illustrates the success of that system. Under the second of the good emperors, Trajan, who was a masterful general, the Roman Empire reached its absolute largest size in AD 117. Its borders stretched all the way from Britain down to Mesopotamia. This was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, at its absolute height.
But, as we all know, golden ages don't last forever. The incredible period of peace and adoptive succession was about to come to a screeching halt, and this marked a turning point from which the empire would never, ever fully recover.
The historian Cassius Dio, who actually lived through all this, he just captured the moment perfectly with this quote. He said,
The rise of the Emperor Commodus in AD 180 marked the descent from a kingdom of gold to one of rust and iron. It's one of the most famous lines in Roman history because, well, it was so tragically accurate.
So the last of the good emperors, the philosopher Marcus Aurelius, made a really fateful choice. He was the first one in almost 100 years to have a natural-born son, and he broke with that successful tradition of adoption and just passed the empire to him. But his son, Commodus, was no philosopher. His reign was self-indulgent, totally erratic, and violent. And his assassination in 192, it plunged the empire right back into civil war and chaos, ending the Roman peace for good.
The chaos that started with Commodus's death eventually led to the Severan dynasty, which was basically military rule. But after that dynasty collapsed, the empire didn't just stumble, it fell right off a cliff. It tumbled into a 50-year period of near-total collapse that we now call the crisis of the 3rd century.
I mean, just look at what was happening all at the same time. You had constant invasions from Germanic tribes and the Persian Empire. You had generals fighting each other in endless civil wars. Get this, there were an astonishing 26 emperors in just 50 years, and most of them were murdered. The economy was in ruins, a massive plague was sweeping through the population. The Roman world was literally coming apart at the seams.
It took a series of really tough soldier emperors to fight the empire back from the brink, and the most important of them was Diocletian, who came to power in 284. He was this brilliant reformer who got it. The old system was broken. The empire was just too big with way too many threats for one person to handle. So he came up with a radical solution to save it.
He called it the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. Here's how it worked. He split the empire into an eastern and a western half. Each half was ruled by a senior emperor, an Augustus, who was helped by a junior emperor, a Caesar. The idea was to finally create a stable succession. When a senior emperor retired or died, his Caesar would take his place and then appoint a new Caesar. And you know what? For a little while, it actually worked. It stabilized the collapsing empire.
Now, Diocletian's system didn't last forever. It eventually fell apart because of the ambitions of guys like Constantine the Great, who wanted to rule it all himself. But the idea of splitting the empire, that stuck around. And this division would become permanent, setting the stage for the final act of the Roman story, at least in the West. This timeline really shows you just how quickly everything unraveled. In 395, the empire's permanently split between two brothers. Just 15 years later, in 410, the unthinkable happens. The city of Rome itself is sacked by invaders for the first time in 800 years. And then finally, in 476, the last emperor in the West, a young boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, is just unceremoniously kicked off the throne by a Germanic chieftain.
So there was no single reason for the fall. It was this long, slow collapse. The Western Empire was just hollowed out by political instability, a weak economy, and constant civil war. It really just didn't have the resources or the manpower anymore to defend its huge frontiers against the waves of migrations and invasions that defined that whole century.
And just like that, the Western Empire was gone, replaced by a bunch of Germanic kingdoms. But this leaves us with one last really fascinating question. While imperial power vanished in the West in 476, the Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, thrived for another 1,000 years. And its people, they always called themselves Romans. So did Rome really fall, or did it just change its address?
You know how sometimes there are symbols hidden in plain sight? An ancient code that somehow survived for more than 2,000 years? Well, today we're cracking one of history's most powerful and, honestly, most successful acronyms, SPQR, and I'm willing to bet you've seen it in way more places than you realize.
For starters, if you've ever walked the streets of Rome, you have absolutely stepped on it. I mean, it's right there, stamped onto thousands of manhole covers and public works. It's a little piece of ancient history, literally under your feet, connecting the city of today with its imperial past.
Or maybe you're a movie fan. If you've seen Gladiator, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The hero, Maximus, has it tattooed right on his arm. And that's not just some random ink. It's a brand of loyalty, a symbol of everything he fought for and everything he lost.
But here's where it gets really wild. This symbol isn't just stuck in Rome. You can find versions of it on city halls in places like Brussels, on bridges, and even inside grand old buildings in Liverpool. So how in the world did one Roman acronym go global?
To really get its incredible journey, we have to start with the most basic question. What do those 4 letters actually stand for? our investigation is going to take us right back to the heart of the Roman Republic. So let's rewind. Our story doesn't begin with emperors or massive empires. It starts with an idea, a really powerful Republican ideal that pretty much defined what it meant to be Roman. And here it is, the big reveal. SPQR stands for Senatus Populusque Romanus. Okay, let's break that down. Senatus, that's the Senate, easy. Populus is the people. The que at the end is just a nifty Latin way of saying and Romanus, of course, means Roman. Put it all together, and you get the Senate and people of Rome. But look, this was so much more than just a name. It was a huge political statement. It was basically shouting that the ultimate authority in Rome didn't come from some king or a divine right, but from two groups working together, the elite, powerful Senate and the populus Romanus, the free citizens of Rome. This whole concept was the bedrock of their government. At the end of the day, SPQR was a declaration of identity. It told the world that the Romans were a populus liber, a free people. This phrase hammered home the idea that they were sovereign, that they were in charge of their own state. It's a concept so powerful that it would inspire political revolutions thousands of years down the line. But of course, history is never that simple, right? The Republic eventually collapsed, emperors rose to power, and this is where the story of SPQR gets really interesting. It transforms from a symbol of actual shared power into a tool for political branding. So the acronym first pops up on inscriptions around 80 BC, late in the Republic. But when Augustus becomes the first emperor, he doesn't get rid of it. No, he embraces it. And this symbol keeps getting used for centuries, changing a little here and there until it finally fades away from official coins under Constantine the Great. For emperors like Augustus, using SPQR was just brilliant political marketing. On the surface, it projected this message of, hey, don't worry, all the old traditions of the Republic are safe with me. But in reality, while the Senate and the people were technically still the source of power, the emperor now held all the real power. SPQR basically became a stamp of approval, a cover of legitimacy for what was now a monarchy. And then you get Emperor Commodus around 180 AD. He does something that might seem small but was actually pretty shocking. He starts flipping the order on some inscriptions to read Populus Senatusque, putting the people before the Senate. This was a total power move, signaling that his loyalty was with the masses and the army, not the old-school aristocracy. Now, you'd think the story of SPQR would end right there with the fall of Rome. But that's really just the beginning of its second, and maybe even more amazing, life. Centuries later, as cities across Europe started fighting for their independence, they looked back to ancient Rome for inspiration. And what did they adopt? Their own versions of SPQR, just swapping out the R for their own city's initial. So you get SPQB for Brussels, SPQL for Liverpool, SPQV for Vienna. It became the ultimate badge of civic pride and self-government. Of course, any acronym that hangs around for over 2 millennia is bound to pick up a few new meanings. In modern Italy, there's this famous, funny reinterpretation of SPQR, Sono pazzi questi Romani. Now that translates to, they're crazy, these Romans, a catchphrase made famous all over the world by the character Obelix from the awesome French Asterix comics. It's just a perfect example of how a super serious, ancient symbol can be lovingly remixed into modern pop culture. So from the center of the Roman Republic to a punchline in a comic book, how did these 4 little letters manage to survive and thrive for so long? What's the secret? Well, the key to its long life has been its incredible ability to adapt. You could say SPQR has had at least 4 different lives. It started as this powerful political ideal of shared power. Then it was co-opted as an imperial brand to make dictators look legitimate. Then it was reborn as a global symbol of city pride. And finally, it found a 4th life as a beloved pop culture joke. Its meaning has just evolved with the times. And that kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. SPQR was Rome's shorthand for its entire identity, a symbol that could mean freedom, power, tradition, or even a good joke all at once. It really makes you wonder, what are the powerful, multi-layered symbols that define our world today?